There are two photographs that tell you everything you need to know about a life spent in someone else's shadow. In the first, two young girls stand side by side in matching coats, their dark hair swept back in identical styles. They could be twins. In the second, taken decades later, one woman stands on the steps of the White House while the other watches from the crowd. The girl in the matching coat had become a princess, but she would never be a queen. Lee Radziwill was born into American aristocracy with beauty, intelligence, and a last name that opened every door in Manhattan. She married royalty, befriended Truman Capote, and had Andy Warhol on speed dial. She was photographed by Richard Avedon and dressed by the world's greatest designers. By any measure, she should have been happy. By any measure, she should have been enough. But Lee Radziwill spent her entire life standing next to Jackie Kennedy, and that proximity would cost her everything. The other Bouvier girl, Caroline Lee. Bouvier entered the world on March 3, 1933 in a Manhattan hospital where the nurses whispered about her family's wealth and social standing. Her father, John Venu Bouvier III, was a stockbroker with matinee-idol looks and a drinking problem that would only worsen with time. Her mother, Janet Norton Lee, came from money and had specific ideas about what her daughters would become. Lee arrived 4 years after her sister Jacqueline, and from that very first moment, she was the other Bouvier girl. The sisters grew up in homes that looked perfect from the outside. There was the Park Avenue apartment, the summer estate in East Hampton, the riding lessons and French tutors and debut balls that their mother planned with military precision. But inside those beautiful rooms, their father's drinking created chaos. Janet Bouvier kept a pristine home where appearances mattered more than truth, where a smile in public could hide any private pain. The girls learned early that what you showed the world mattered more than what you felt inside. Lee was the prettier one. Even their mother admitted that. Where Jackie had a face that was interesting rather than beautiful, Lee possessed the kind of classical features that cameras loved. Her eyes were larger, her bone structure more delicate, her smile more natural. But Jackie had something else. She had a quality that made people lean in when she spoke. A way of making whoever she talked to feel like the most important person in the room. Janet noticed this difference, though she rarely spoke of it directly. When Lee was 10, her parents' marriage finally collapsed under the weight of John Bouvier's infidelities and alcoholism. Their mother wasted no time finding a replacement. Within 2 years, she married Hugh Auchincloss, a wealthy lawyer whose fortune dwarfed the Bouvier money. Suddenly, the girls had a stepfather with vast estates, political connections, and children from previous marriages. They went from being the center of their small family universe to being part of something larger and more complex. Jackie adapted to this new world with her characteristic grace. She went to Vassar and the Sorbonne, dated powerful men, and seemed to glide through life with a plan only she could see. Lee watched and learned. She attended Miss Porter's school, where she was popular, but unremarkable academically. She was prettier than her sister. Yes, but beauty alone wasn't enough in the world their mother had built for them. You needed to marry well. You needed to marry someone who mattered. At 18, Lee thought she'd found him. Michael Canfield was handsome, charming, and worked in publishing. He came from a good family, also everyone believed. The wedding in 1953 was exactly the kind of society event Janet Auchincloss loved to orchestrate. Lee wore white and smiled for the cameras. And for a brief moment, she wasn't the other Bouvier girl. She was a bride, a wife, someone creating her own story. But Michael Canfield wasn't quite who he seemed. Rumors circulated that he was actually the illegitimate son of the Duke of Kent, which would have made him British royalty. The rumors were never confirmed, but they didn't matter anyway. What mattered was that the marriage was wrong from the beginning. Lee had married to escape comparison, to build something separate from her sister. Instead, she trapped herself in a relationship with a man she didn't love, in a life that felt like it was happening to someone else. And then Jackie met Jack Kennedy, and everything changed forever, becoming a princess. The Kennedy courtship played out in the society pages and political columns. Here was the beautiful debutante and the charismatic young senator. A story so perfect it seemed written by Hollywood. Lee watched her sister navigate this world with the same careful grace she applied to everything. When Jackie married John F. Kennedy in September 1953, just months after Lee's own wedding, the ceremony drew crowds and cameras. It was, everyone agreed, the wedding of the decade. Lee's marriage to Michael Canfield limped along for several more years. They moved to London where Michael worked and Lee tried to create a life that felt authentic. But London in the 1950s wasn't ready to embrace an American girl playing at British society. She was too bold, too American, too determined to matter. She threw parties and wore beautiful clothes and cultivated friendships with artists and writers. But something essential was missing. The marriage everyone could see was hollow. Lee wanted more. Stanislaw Ulrich Radziwill entered her life like a character from a novel. He was a Polish prince, a legitimate aristocrat whose family had lost everything to the Nazis and Soviets, but retained their titles and dignity. He was handsome, cultured, educated at Oxford, and working in London's financial sector. When he met Lee, she was still married to Michael Canfield. But that didn't stop what happened next. In the careful language of the era, they began keeping company. In plainer terms, they fell into an affair that everyone in their circle knew about, but nobody acknowledged publicly. Lee divorced Michael Canfield in 1959. She married Stanislaw Radziwill almost immediately afterward in a civil ceremony in Virginia. Janet Orkin-Kloss was quietly horrified that her daughter was marrying a divorced Catholic in what the church would never recognize as a valid marriage. But Lee had achieved something Jackie couldn't claim. She was now Princess Lee Radziwill. The title was real, if functionally meaningless in the modern world. Still, it was hers. The early years of the Radziwill marriage had moments of genuine happiness. They had 2 children, Anthony and Anna Christina, and split their time between London and New York. Stanislaw, called Stars by everyone who knew him, was intelligent and supportive. He understood Lee's need to be more than just a wife and mother. He encouraged her ambitions, even when those ambitions led her in directions that made other people uncomfortable. Their London home became a gathering place for artists, intellectuals, and the kind of interesting people who valued conversation over pedigree. Lee threw dinner parties that mixed Polish aristocrats with British actors, American writers with European designers. She was creating finally a world that reflected her own tastes and interests rather than simply following the path her mother had laid out for her. Stars supported these efforts. Music, understanding that his wife needed creative outlets beyond the traditional roles of princess and mother. Lee was a devoted mother to Anthony and Anna Christina, but she refused to let motherhood consume her identity entirely. She hired nannies who could provide daily care while she pursued her interests. This was unusual for women of her class at the time, when hands-on mothering was expected, even among those who could afford help. But Lee had watched her own mother lose herself in the project of managing her daughters' lives, and she was determined not to repeat that pattern. But by now, Jackie wasn't just the wife of a senator. In 1960, Jack Kennedy won the presidency and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy became First Lady of the United States. The transformation was absolute. Overnight, Jackie became the most photographed, most discussed, most analyzed woman in the world. Her clothes started trends. Her hairstyle was copied by millions. Her soft voice and cultural initiatives and restoration of the White House made her a global icon. And Lee was her sister, just her sister. But what came next would test their relationship in ways neither of them could have imagined. Living in the shadow. Here's what nobody talks about. Lee was with Jackie in the White House more than almost anyone outside the immediate Kennedy family. She visited constantly, stayed for weeks at a time, traveled with the First Lady on official trips. The 2 sisters remained genuinely close, calling each other daily, sharing private jokes and observations. In photographs from those years, you can see real affection between them. Lee wasn't pretending to love her sister. The love was real. The pain was real, too. Imagine attending a state dinner where your sister is the guest of honor, where ambassadors and movie stars and the most powerful people in the world compete for a moment of her attention. You're there, too, wearing a beautiful gown, smiling and charming and saying all the right things. But nobody asks you about your life. They ask you about Jackie. What's she really like? Is she as wonderful as she seems? Can you introduce me? You're a princess, married to actual royalty, mother of 2 children. a woman with your own thoughts and dreams and accomplishments. But in that room, you're an accessory to your sister's life. Lee handled this with remarkable grace, at least in public. She attended the White House functions and posed for the photographs and played the role assigned to her. But privately, friends noticed the strain. She drank more than she used to. Her wit, always sharp, sometimes had an edge that cut close to cruelty. She talked about wanting to act, to write, to do something that was entirely her own. Truman Capote became one of her closest friends during this period. The celebrated author saw something in Lee that others missed. He recognized her intelligence, her genuine appreciation for art and literature, her desperate need to be valued for who she was rather than whose sister she was. Their friendship would last for years, surviving scandals and feuds, music, that destroyed Capote's relationships with almost everyone else. To Truman, Lee wasn't Jackie's sister. She was Lee fully herself, and that recognition meant everything to her. They spent hours together in New York, attending gallery openings and theater premieres. Music, having long lunches where they discussed books and art and the absurdities of high society. Capote valued Lee's opinions on his work, sought her advice on social matters, and treated her as an intellectual equal. In his company, Lee could be sharp and funny without worrying that every word would be compared to something Jackie had said. She could express opinions that were hers alone, cultivated through her own reading and thinking, without someone mentioning that Jackie had recently expressed a similar or different view. The friendship gave Lee something she desperately needed, a space where she mattered for herself. Capote introduced her to other writers and artists who knew her primarily through him, not through her sister. These friendships became lifelines, music connections to a world where her value wasn't determined by her last name or her family connections. In 1963, Lee invited Jackie to join her on a vacation to Greece. Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate, offered them use of his yacht. The trip should have been a simple escape. Music, a chance for the First Lady to relax away from Washington's pressures. Instead, it became a tabloid sensation. The photos of Jackie aboard Onassis' yacht created a minor scandal. Her husband was furious. The press questioned whether it was appropriate for the First Lady to accept such lavish hospitality from a foreign businessman. Nobody paid much attention to the fact that Onassis and Lee had become close, very close. They shared long conversations about art and business. He listened when she talked, really listened, in a way that most men in her life never had. The nature of their relationship remained ambiguous, at least in public. But people noticed. People always noticed. Then came November 22, 1963, and everything shattered in ways no one could have predicted. The year everything changed. Lee was in London when she learned her brother-in-law had been shot in Dallas. She caught the first flight she could get, desperate to reach her sister. By the time she landed, music President Kennedy was dead. She found Jackie in a blood-stained pink suit, moving through the nightmare with the same careful control she applied to everything else. Lee stayed with her sister through the funeral, through the days of impossible grief that followed, through the awful realization that nothing would ever be the same again. In those dark weeks, Lee was exactly what Jackie needed. She was family, someone who understood without explanations, someone who could be present without demanding anything in return. For once, being Jackie's sister mattered more than anything else Lee could have been. She set aside her own grief and focused on helping Jackie survive. But grief is strange. It changes people in ways they don't expect. Jackie had lost her husband in the most public, most traumatic way imaginable. The world watched her suffer. The world expected her to suffer beautifully with dignity in a way that wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. And Jackie music, being Jackie, did exactly that. But the cost was enormous. Lee grieved too for her brother-in-law and for what the violence had done to her sister. But her grief got lost in the shadow of Jackie's tragedy. People asked Lee how Jackie was doing. They didn't ask how Lee was managing, watching her sister's pain, helping raise Jackie's children, trying to hold together a family that felt like it was falling apart. Aristotle Onassis began paying more attention to Jackie after the tragedy. He was kind, generous, offering support and escape from the constant scrutiny. He invited Jackie and the children to his private island. He sent gifts and made phone calls and presented himself as someone who understood the burden of public attention. Lee watched this happening. She saw the man she'd been close to turning his considerable charm toward her widowed sister. The next few years played out like a slow-motion betrayal that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Onassis courted Jackie with the same intensity he'd once directed at cultivating his business empire. He showered her with attention, promised her privacy and security, offered her a life away from the cameras that never stopped following America's most famous widow. Jackie, exhausted from years of performing grief, began to accept his overtures. In 1968, Jackie married Aristotle Onassis. The wedding shocked the world. She was American royalty, the martyred president's widow, and she'd married a foreign businessman 23 years her senior. The press called it a betrayal of Kennedy's memory. The public felt confused, even angry. How could she marry someone so different from Jack Kennedy? Lee felt something else entirely. The man she'd been close to, who'd listened to her and valued her opinions, had chosen her sister instead. Again, Jackie got the presidency, the White House, the global adoration, and now she'd gotten Onassis, too. It didn't matter that Lee's own marriage to stars was already troubled. It didn't matter that she might not have wanted to marry Onassis herself. What mattered was the pattern, the endless repetition of being second choice in her own life. The sisters' relationship grew complicated after Jackie's marriage to Onassis. They still loved each other, still talked regularly. But something had shifted. Lee began pursuing her own ambitions with new intensity, as if she needed to prove that she existed independently of her sister's shadow. And what she chose to pursue would lead to some of the most painful public failures of her life, the dream of acting. She decided to become an actress, not in small productions or amateur theater, but on the professional stage and screen. In 1967, before Jackie's marriage to Onassis, Lee had appeared in a television production of a classic play. The critics were not kind. They called her performance amateurish and stiff. They questioned whether she'd earned the role through talent or name recognition. The reviews stung, but Lee pressed forward. She took acting lessons seriously, working with coaches who tried to help her develop technique and presence. In 1968, she appeared in another production. Again, the critics sharpened their knives. They pointed out that she was beautiful but unconvincing, that she seemed to be playing at acting rather than actually inhabiting her characters. The reviews were harsh enough that major producers stopped returning her calls. But Lee tried one more time. In 1972, she appeared in a production in Chicago, hoping that distance from New York's critical establishment might give her a fairer hearing. The critics followed her to Chicago. They wrote the same things they'd written before. This time, Lee heard them. She quietly stopped pursuing acting roles after that. The failure hurt more than anyone knew. Lee had genuinely loved performing. She'd worked hard, taken the criticism seriously, tried to improve. But talent isn't democratic. Wanting something badly doesn't make you good at it. And being Lee Radziwill, beautiful and cultured and connected, didn't translate into being a capable actress. The world watched her fail at the one thing she tried to do independently, and the watching made the failure absolute. She turned to interior design next, a field where her natural taste and connections could actually help her succeed. Lee had always had exceptional style, an ability to create beautiful spaces that felt both elegant and livable. She took on clients, designed homes, built a reputation that had nothing to do with her sister. For a while, this worked. She was good at design, legitimately talented, and people hired her based on the quality of her work. Her marriage to stars Radziwill, meanwhile, was quietly falling apart. They'd grown in different directions, wanted different things from life. Stars was content with his work and family, happy to maintain a lower profile. Lee needed more. She needed to be seen, recognized, valued. The marriage limped along for years before they formally separated in the mid-1970s. They never divorced, remaining legally married until Este's death in 1976, but they stopped being partners long before that. Lee's relationship with Aristotle Onassis and Jackie remained complex during these years. She still saw Onassis occasionally, still maintained the friendship that had existed before his marriage to her sister. When Onassis died in 1975, Lee grieved for him. Jackie had already begun separating from him emotionally, their marriage having soured after the death of Onassis' son in a plane crash. But Lee remembered the man who'd listened to her, who'd made her feel interesting and valued. She grieved for what might have been in another life where she wasn't Jackie's sister. The pattern of loss was establishing itself now, one that would define the rest of Lee's life, searching for identity. The 1970s and 1980s should have been Lee's time to build something lasting. She had connections throughout New York's art and fashion worlds. She was friends with artists, writers, designers, people who created things that mattered. But she never quite figured out what she wanted to create for herself. She worked as a special events coordinator for Gio Armani for several years, helping introduce the Italian designer to American society. It was work that suited her talents, combining her aesthetic sense with her social connections. She was good at it, respected in the role, able to open doors that might have remained closed to others. But it wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. In 1988, at age 55, Lee married again. Herbert Ross was a successful film and theater director, someone with real accomplishments in his own field. He'd directed beloved films and worked with major stars. The marriage seemed to promise a new chapter, a chance for Lee to be part of a partnership between equals. But Ross was deeply involved in his work, often absent for film productions that took him away for months at a time. Lee found herself alone again, married, but not really partnered. That marriage lasted 3 years before they divorced in 1991. Lee never married again after that. She'd been a Canfield, a Radziwill, and a Ross, and none of those identities had fit quite right. At 58, she went back to being simply Lee, though she kept using the Radziwill name that gave her at least the title of princess. Her relationship with Jackie went through cycles during these years. They'd be close for months, talking daily, visiting regularly. Then something would happen, some slight, real or imagined, and they'd drift apart. Jackie's life had settled into a different pattern after Onassis died in 1975. She worked as a book editor, dated other men, raised her children, and maintained her position as American royalty without actually being royal. She seemed finally content. Lee watched her sister find peace and struggled to find her own. She drank more than she should have. She spent money she didn't always have, maintaining a lifestyle that looked glamorous from outside but felt empty from within. She moved between homes in New York and Paris. Always beautifully dressed, always at the right parties, always smiling for the cameras that never really stopped following her. Friends from this period remember Lee as whip-smart and funny, capable of devastating wit and genuine warmth, but they also remember the sadness that seemed to shadow her, especially when she talked about her sister. The love was still there, deep and real, but so was the resentment, the lifetime of comparisons, the exhaustion of always being the other one. When Jackie was diagnosed with cancer in 1994, Lee was there. She visited the hospital, helped coordinate care, stood by her sister through treatments that ultimately failed. Jackie Kennedy Onassis died on May 19, 1994 at age 64. Lee was with her at the end. The grief was complicated. Lee had lost her sister, her lifelong companion, the person who'd known her longer than anyone else. But she'd also lost the thing that had defined her entire existence. For 61 years, she'd been Jackie's sister. Now Jackie was gone. Who was Lee supposed to be? The answer to that question would prove even more painful than anyone expected. The final losses. The weeks after Jackie's funeral passed in a blur of condolence calls and legal meetings. Lee moved through them mechanically, accepting embraces from people who'd known both sisters, fielding questions about memorial services and charitable donations in Jackie's name. She was performing grief for an audience again, just as she'd done after Jack Kennedy's death 31 years earlier. But this time was different. This time there was no returning to normal afterward. Jackie had been her constant, the fixed point around which Lee's entire life orbited. Without that center, everything felt unmet. The reading of Jackie's will came several weeks after the funeral. Lee sat in the lawyer's office in Manhattan, surrounded by Jackie's children, Caroline and John Jr., along with various attorneys and executives. The estate was substantial. Jackie had been shrewd with Onassis's money, investing wisely, building wealth that would ensure her children's security for generations. Lee listened as the lawyer read through the bequests. Caroline and John would inherit the bulk of everything. The Martha's Vineyard property, the New York apartment, the investments and trusts. There were provisions for Jackie's longtime staff for various charities she'd supported. And then came Lee's name, a few pieces of furniture, some books they'd both loved as children, a bracelet their father had given them, personal items, sentimental perhaps, but nothing of financial substance. The lawyer continued reading, but Lee had stopped listening. She understood what the will was saying, even if Jackie had never said it directly. Caroline and John were Jackie's legacy, her real family. Lee was something else, beloved perhaps, but separate. The years of daily phone calls, the countless visits, the shared history spanning more than 6 decades, all of it distilled down to a few personal mementos that would fit in a single box. Lee maintained her composure throughout the meeting. She thanked the lawyers, embraced Caroline and John, and left the office with her head high. Only later, alone in her apartment, did she allow herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Some friends suggested Jackie had assumed Lee would be fine financially, that the small bequests were meant as tokens of affection rather than practical support. Others whispered that it was a final statement, an acknowledgement of the distance that had always existed between the sisters despite their closeness. The truth, as with most family dynamics, was probably more complicated. Jackie had devoted her final years to ensuring her children's futures, to building something that would outlast her. In that calculation, Lee simply didn't figure as prominently as she might have hoped. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was priority. And for Lee, who had spent 61 years as the secondary consideration in nearly every comparison to her sister, it felt like a pattern repeating itself one final time from beyond the grave. The months following Jackie's death revealed other painful truths. Invitations that had always arrived for Lee to gallery openings, charity galas, society dinners began to dry up. People who'd always been friendly grew distant. Lee realized with dawning horror that many of her social connections had been based not on who she was, but on whose sister she was. Without Jackie, her value in certain circles had diminished dramatically. She tried to maintain her routines. She attended fashion shows and art exhibitions. She had lunch with old friends who remained loyal. But something fundamental had shifted. At 61, Lee found herself reassessing everything she'd believed about her life and her place in the world. The role she'd resented, Jackie's sister, had also been the role that gave her access, relevance, a kind of reflected importance. Now that role had ended, and what remained felt frighteningly insubstantial, her son Anthony became her anchor during this period. He and his wife Carol provided the kind of unconditional love and support that had been absent from so much of Lee's life. Anthony had always understood his mother in ways few others did. He recognized her intelligence, appreciated her humor, and never reduced her to being merely his famous aunt's sister. In Anani's eyes, Lee was simply his mother, flawed and complicated and wholly herself. But Anthony was sick. He'd been diagnosed with testicular cancer in 1989, shortly before his mother would need him most. The diagnosis had been devastating, but treatment had seemed successful initially. For several years, he'd been in remission, living a full life with Carol, working in television production, building a career that had nothing to do with his famous relatives. In late 1994, just months after Jackie's death, the cancer returned. This time it was more aggressive, spreading to other parts of his body despite aggressive treatment. Lee threw herself into helping him fight it, just as she'd thrown herself into helping Jackie during her final illness. She researched treatments, consulted with specialists, paid for experimental therapies that insurance wouldn't cover. Money at least was something she still had, though her finances were increasingly strained by the lifestyle she refused to abandon. The next 4 years became a cycle of hope and disappointment. Anthony would respond to treatment, seem to improve, and then the cancer would return. Each recurrence was harder to combat, each recovery less complete. Lee watched her only son wage a battle he was slowly losing, and there was nothing her title, her connections, or her money could do to change the outcome. Anthony died on August 10, 1999. He was 40 years old. The funeral was small, attended by family and close friends. Carol was there, devastated by the loss of her husband of just 5 years. Anna Christina, Lee's daughter, mourned the brother with whom she'd grown up in London and New York, and Lee stood at the grave of her son, facing a grief that eclipsed everything else she'd experienced. Parents are not supposed to bury their children. Natural order had been violated in the most fundamental way. Lee, who had already lost her sister 5 years earlier, who had spent her life losing in countless smaller ways, now faced a loss so profound that it seemed to crack something essential inside her. She had been a daughter who couldn't match her sister, a wife who'd been married 3 times without finding lasting partnership, a woman who tried and failed at multiple careers. But she had been a devoted mother to Anthony and Anna Christina, and that role had been one she truly valued. Now Anthony was gone, and Lee was 66 years old, facing the remainder of her life without the people who'd mattered most. Jackie was dead. Anthony was dead. Stars had died years earlier. Her father had been dead for decades. Her mother had passed away in 1989. The scaffolding of family that had supported her, even as it constrained her, had largely collapsed. In the months after Anani's death, friends noticed Lee becoming more withdrawn. She still appeared at important events, but the performance seemed to cost her more now. The mask she'd worn for decades was growing heavier. Carol remained close to Lee, becoming one of the few people who saw past her carefully constructed public persona. Carol saw Lee not as Jackie Kennedy's sister, but as Anani's mother, a woman navigating a world that felt emptier without him. The financial pressures that had been building for years became acute. Anani's illness had been expensive. Experimental treatments, specialized care, constant travel to different facilities, resources drained. The Paris apartment had to be sold. Furniture and art went to auction. She scaled back everything. For Lee, who had grown up with extraordinary wealth and married a prince, financial constraint felt like another kind of failure. But life rarely works according to plan, and Lee's financial decline became another source of private shame that she hid behind public composure. The final chapter. The final years were quiet. Lee lived in a small apartment in New York, much reduced from the grand spaces she'd once occupied. She saw friends occasionally, maintained relationships with her daughter Anna Christina and her granddaughters, but she'd largely withdrawn from public life. The fashion world still loved her. In 2012, she appeared in campaigns for high-end designers. Her face at 79 still beautiful in the way that Good Bones and Lifetime style create. She looked elegant in the photographs, perfectly composed, giving nothing away. But people who saw her in person noticed the fragility, the sense that she was tired of performing. In 2013, Lee gave an interview where she spoke more candidly than usual about her relationship with Jackie. She described feeling like she'd always been second choice, always living in shadow. She talked about the pain of watching her sister become an icon while she remained a footnote. The interviewer noted that even in old age, even after Jackie had been dead for nearly 2 decades, the wound was still fresh. But Lee also spoke about love. She'd loved Jackie truly and deeply. They'd been sisters in the fullest sense, sharing not just blood, but experiences, memories, the particular knowledge that comes from growing up together in a complicated family. The resentment was real, but it coexisted with genuine affection. Relationships, Lee seemed to be saying, can hold contradictions. You can love someone and still feel hurt by them. You can be grateful for someone's presence in your life, while also wishing you'd had the chance to exist separately from them. Her daughter-in-law, Carol, who'd found fame in reality television years after Anani's death, remained close to Lee. The two women had bonded over their shared grief, and Carol often spoke publicly about Lee's intelligence and humor. She described a woman who was much more than Jackie's sister, who had depth and complexity that the public never fully appreciated. Lee's health declined slowly through the 2000s. She had mobility issues that made navigating New York increasingly difficult. Friends visited her at home, bringing news from the world she'd once inhabited so fully. She still dressed beautifully, still maintained the standards of appearance that had been drilled into her as a child. Even diminished, even struggling, she refused to let the mask slip entirely. In early 2019, Lee's health worsened significantly. She died on February 15, 2019 at age 85. The obituaries all mention Jackie in the first paragraph. Even in death, Lee couldn't escape the comparison. The New York Times called her a socialite and style icon. Vogue praised her impeccable taste, but almost every article defined her primarily in relation to her famous sister. Her daughter, Anna, Christina, and granddaughters survived her along with her daughter-in-law Carol. The funeral was private, attended by family and close friends. There was no state funeral, no outpouring of national grief like there had been for Jackie. Lee's passing was noted by those who remembered her, mourned by those who'd loved her, and largely forgotten by a world that had never quite figured out who she was beyond her sister's shadow. A life in shadow. Here's what we lost when we reduced Lee Radziwill to Jackie's sister. We lost the story of a woman who tried desperately to create her own identity in a world determined to define her through someone else. We lost the complexity of a relationship between sisters who loved each other but were also trapped in patterns of comparison that neither of them created but both had to endure. Lee Radziwill was intelligent, stylish, cultured, and genuinely interesting in her own right. She had close friendships with some of the most creative people of her generation. She raised 2 children largely on her own while maintaining a public persona that never showed the strain. She survived 3 marriages, the deaths of her sister and son, financial difficulties, and the relentless scrutiny that came from being part of America's closest thing to royalty. But none of that mattered as much as whose sister she was. The tragedy of Lee's life wasn't that she failed to accomplish things. It was that her accomplishments were never enough, could never be enough, because they were always measured against Jackie's enormous shadow. No matter what Lee did, the question was always the same. Yes, but how does it compare to what your sister did? In the end, Lee spent 85 years trying to answer a question that had no good answer. She was beautiful in a world where her sister was iconic. She was charming in a world where her sister was beloved. She was accomplished in a world where her sister had been First Lady. The deck was stacked from the beginning, and Lee knew it, and she played the hand. She was dealt with as much grace as anyone could reasonably expect. The photographs from her final years show a woman who'd stopped fighting the comparison. She looked comfortable finally with who she was. Maybe she'd made peace with being the sister who lived in shadow. Or maybe she was just tired of performing for a world that had never really seen her anyway. We'll never know what Lee Radziwill might have become if she'd been born into a different family, with a different sister, into a different kind of life. We only know what she was. A woman of extraordinary taste and intelligence who never quite escaped the shadow of someone more famous. A woman who deserved to be remembered for who she was, not just for whose sister she was. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.